All right, welcome everybody. My name is Norm. I'm with Strong Towns, and I'm also the leader of Delpop, which is Deltons for people-oriented places over in Delta. My first house after I got married was in Willoughby Heights, and so I've lived in this area, grown to love it, and also understand some of the challenges that Langley is facing, and have been privileged to be able to connect with James as well as some of the others, Kip from Strong Towns Vancouver, as well as Manav and others that we did a presentation there last night on the question of housing and what to do about the housing cup that we're in. But tonight I want to talk about the situation that we find ourselves in when it comes to appraising and understanding the role of a street in a community and making sure that we're able to actually generate capacity for our community to grow and prosper rather than stifling our prospects and creating significant restrictions on what is possible in our communities. And so a good street is more than just a fantastic place to be. It's a vital building block for a strong community, which also means that it's a terrible thing to waste. And one of the hallmarks of the suburban experiment has been a diminishing and a misunderstanding of what it actually takes to make a street productive, to make a street viable, to make a street, whether for places where people live, whether places where people gather, whether for places where people work or shop or recreate or find cultural opportunities together. All of those things are wrapped up in great streets. And it's sort of like the definition of pornography that one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices used, which was, you know it when you see it. If I ask you, what is a great street? You can begin to identify, oh, that makes for a great street. That's a place that I feel welcome. That's a place where I, as a person, feel dignified to be. And we'll touch on why it's so critical to have this and how it unlocks so much value. It's also a remarkable incubator of prosperity. And so Strong Towns has a ton of allies that are with us in the quest for safe streets. So think of Vision Zero Network or the Complete Streets movement, various other initiatives that are taken at the local level, sometimes in honor of a young child that was struck and killed. That was the situation in Surrey when I was working in the mayor's office, and a young girl had been struck and killed by a drunk driver. And so in her honor, there was significant efforts made to try to improve safety on the streets. And so we say we have a ton, America Walks and other organizations like that, Trails Canada, all committed to what it takes for places to be safe. But one of the things that Strong Towns, and I want to lay out some of the case for this tonight, one of the things that gives us additional opportunities to find very different allies in this work is by also focusing on the productive capacity of our streets. I would say this is the arguments for the suits. This is the arguments for the people that are just persuaded by facts or figures that really get to the bottom line of how well their community functions, or in reverse, why we can't have nice things. Because we put so little away in the productive capacity of our land that the consequences were constantly threadbare when it comes to the things that we need to maintain, keep up, and improve in our communities. And so we're committed to, and one of our core campaigns as an organization, as a movement, is to really underscore the core relationship between places being safe, but actually being able to be productive as a core aspect of this. And it also means that one of the challenges that a lot of our Safe Streets allies face is that they hit various types of cultural opposition. They hit various types of subjective forms of opposition. Well, I don't like a bike lane, or I never use a cycling track, or I don't like those things. And so therefore I'm not on board with what you're saying. Yeah, safety matters, but we can be safe in other ways if we drive in larger vehicles or we manage our streetscape in a different way. But Strong Towns says, let's begin then with the observation that streets are a platform for building wealth. And so in contrast with roads, in the Strong Towns language, we have two types of roadways or facilities for moving vehicles and people. The one is a street, which serves as a platform for building wealth, which is preeminently defined by slowness of travel, as well as the capacity to linger, to gather, to spend money in a place, or to get to know one another, to be able to hear one another, to be able to actually engage with one's life as a person on foot or a person moving in a wheelchair, or all of these things. And that streets have to have that capacity in order to serve as platforms for building wealth. Think of the most desirable neighborhoods in our communities. Frequently, there are places where you can walk, and there are places where you can hear yourself think, and there are places where you can engage with your neighbors. Although depending on the urban design of the neighborhood, it may vary significantly as to whether or not you actually do. But the street itself allows that. For example, whereas in contrast, the road, and this is core, again, to Strong Towns and so much more, is that the road is supposed to be a thing that connects productive places to each other. Constellations of streets with roads that serve as a rapid, expedited way of getting there. The challenge that we have is that we have confused the two. We've tried to upgrade many of our streets to serve road-like functions, and as a consequence, we end up with the stroke. But in this context, one of the things that I observed is that the cul-de-sac, which is very commonplace and widespread, even in these areas, that the cul-de-sac is the ultimate defensive mechanism against your street being improved to become a road. When I worked in the city of Surrey, one of the challenges that we would have is that residential streets were suddenly being identified as arterials. And the next thing that they knew, they said, why is it that all of the things that made this place safe and quiet are being stripped away? But if you design your neighborhood as a savvy developer, you're going to build a cul-de-sac, because that can never be upgraded to actually carry more vehicles. It will only ever serve the place where it is. Yet the challenge is that cul-de-sacs do not work well for connecting places. They do not work well for actually allowing a widespread building of wealth, as well as the gradual increase in investment in those areas. It becomes very difficult to work with that built form. And so one of the challenges is that we see that there's such a relationship between land use and transportation. And many of the transportation decisions that we've made and that we see widespread on the roads around us are contributing to the challenge that we have, that we are struggling to build wealth. We're struggling to actually capture sufficient wealth, even in places like Lower Mainland, where it feels like all we see is wealth in many people's pockets and yet struggles in so many of our own. And so in this context, one of the things that I want to introduce tonight and give some examples of this is that the prevailing pattern of development is making North American cities and towns weak and fragile. And Strong Towns as a movement, as a collection of people like yourself that care about this, are seeking to change that, seeking to undo past wrongs, but also identify the much healthier, more sustainable pattern for addressing what we have, which is not only a spending problem, but also a revenue problem. I didn't have the map for Langley, but this is Peterborough, Ontario. Our friends at Urban 3 put together this fascinating diagram of the way in which you can see the initial establishment of the city and the general area that it took. Between 1841 and 1941, you see a very constrained sort of space. Even as the population is beginning to grow, it doubles in population, and yet the base of the city does not expand rapidly. By 1942 to 1961, you begin to see yet another increase. And then all of a sudden the city said, hey, if we just annex everything around us, we're going to be a big city. We're going to be a big boy today. And the consequence of this is that they took on all of this additional liabilities, all of these additional challenges that they needed in order to upkeep this whole space. And so you can see a sudden rapid decline in the population density, which from a Strong Towns perspective, when we think about the financial performance of a place, population density serves as a proxy for financial performance if you were investing sort of a relatively similar amount of infrastructure into what it takes to build or to have people living in these places. Let me say that one other way. If you want to have a very low service pattern for, say, a rural area that's sort of merging into semi-rural areas with a little bit of urban life, you can do that. That'll look like gravel roads. That'll look like ditches. That'll look like having to go into town to get your mail. That'll look like going into town to go to the library. But instead, what began to happen is that suburban neighborhoods would be built out all at once. After the Second World War, there was a whole flattening out of all across North America around the outskirts of our major cities. And the consequence of this is that the promise was you will receive city-like service at rural level density. And you'll be able to just enjoy the fruits of that. And for a while, it worked to get, as you see, all of a sudden you see this dip and this lack of capacity, and they continue to expand, they continue to grow. And so at Urban 3, that's a little bit faded, but you can see the road per person, the amount of infrastructure that was required. And so without having to add significantly more roads, they were still adding population. By doubling down on existing infrastructure, making it more capable, making it more productive, they were broadening their base of tax-paying residents that can simultaneously subsidize and pay for the core costs that were there. Because out of the fullness of private wealth in a place, we take a fraction of that, And depending on your political leanings, you decide how much of a fraction is too much or not. But we take just a fraction of that private wealth to pay for public needs and public liabilities and public obligations like fire service or water or sewage or parks or so many other things. And so in this context, Peterborough suddenly finds itself with half the population density and yet double the amount of roads that they previously had, which raises the question, do we have a spending problem? Do we have a problem that we have a significant outlay of obligations to meet? We must pave these roads because that's the standard that we've set for them. We've created this whole road network all the way across. And this is in Abbotsford, this is in Mission, this is in Maple Ridge. They're going to be facing this significantly in so many different ways. This is Surrey, this is even Delta. We're in the city of Delta, just as one example of the impact of suppressing the increase of population density. Our school district has not gained in population since the 1980s. So we've even added more homes, we've added more density, and yet we've struggled to actually create the types of things that are necessary for a healthy community to be able to thrive. These are American numbers. I could tell you that folks at Urban 3, when they were working in Peterborough, would have maps to show you the same thing here. They're working in Cochrane, Alberta. If they came to the Lower Mainland, they would be showing you the same thing. But this is in Kansas City. Over a 100-year span, they had a 1.8 times increase in population. And yet at the same time, the commitment that they made through physical infrastructure that was placed in the ground was a 27 times increase. That means you've got a spending problem. You've both not only spent too much up front for a limit for diminishing returns, but you've also created an enduring liability, an enduring obligation. You can't just decide one day, hey, we're going to go back to 1.1 feet of sewer pipe per person. It just doesn't work that way if the development pattern does not sustain that capacity. South Bend, Indiana actually experienced, and this is not all that uncommon as well, a negative population gain for population numbers, dropped by 22% in their population. And yet during that time, they did an examination of sewer systems there. And you see just 3 lift stations for per person. No, sorry, that would be a lot. Not 3 per 3 lift stations in the city expanded to 43. That is by identifying more and more places throughout the city where perhaps the development was not best suited, and yet they always had the promise of using mechanical pumps to be able to deal with sewer, to be able to deal with water. You see a 1,300% increase. And the miles of force main, the expensive stuff, as the city of Calgary is discovering when it comes to water treatment and water infrastructure as well as sewage infrastructure, increased by 6,400%, which is just mind-boggling to go from 0.3 miles all the way up to 19 as they go along. Tied into that, so in addition to a rapidly intensifying land use pattern that requires a lot more resources than the capacity of the community to provide for it, one of the challenges that we have, and this is down in Kirkland, Washington, where I did the analysis of their downtown little area, simple little structure, 2-story structure. You can see this is a 0.26 acre site. Its actual value is only $77,000. Sorry, that's the text. That's the text. Its a total assessed value is $9.2 million. But on a per acre basis, that works up to $35.4 million per acre. Then if you go just a little bit further out, you begin to change the development pattern. You begin to dabble in the things that are much more commonplace in the context of the suburban landscape, seeing the very significant difference from streetscape to now all of a sudden roadscape. The consequence of it is a significant plummeting in the value per acre. So this is a much larger site, but being used in a far less efficient way so that there's less wealth being captured in that space. Yes, it has a higher ticket value, but it's dissipated over a 2.83 acre space. I picked Kirkland because it's the home of Costco. And so I ran the numbers on the Costco, and on a 15.2 acre site, the value per acre drops to just $2.6 million. And the consequence of this is that they were contributing about $21,000 per year in property taxes to the city on a per acre basis. So if you're going to set aside 15.2 acres, you're going to only be getting $21,000 per acre at the end of each year for the needs of your residents, for the upkeep of the place, for all of the provision of infrastructure that's needed in that area. What do you think it is for the downtown? Well, if that multiple from 35 to 2 is about a 14x multiplier, you can see the impact to the city's bottom line by having way more of this, having made this legal and made this so difficult that one it barely even crosses their mind to actually do this type of development on the right, even though it's way more financially productive for the community. If you think 14 times, this is that was in Kirkland, Washington, but I did a talk in Chilliwack, BC, and this is the veganist grocer right in their downtown. A beleaguered spot, you could say. You can see by the bars on the window. If you go to Google Maps, there's been at least 3 or 4 other businesses over the last number of years. And so these folks are trying to sell you rutabagas for at probably a pricey rate because they're trying to keep their business open. Meanwhile, you've got Superstore. So Loblaws and the Weston family are owning the Superstore. And notice a significant contrast. We've got a productive business, but it's on 0.11 acres compared to an 8.6 acre site. This one is right next to the highway. This one is right next to a ton of public investment in infrastructure. Whereas the one that's downtown, because of its limited street front, is actually sharing that obligation with so many more businesses, which is why when we compare on a per acre basis, we see the value in comparing like for like. We can see the relative financial performance of our communities. And so this little vegan grocer is contributing $150,000 per acre in annual property tax. And it won't surprise you that the Superstore doesn't even come close. Which again, as I said last night to the folks in Vancouver, this is why your rutabaga costs a little bit more than the organic grocer. In addition to the other input costs, they are also saddled with or burdened with the fact that we have subsidized this to such an extent, or in our community in Ladner, we've got a great Walmart, not a great Walmart, a great McDonald's. And it pays 1/7 the amount of property tax per acre that our little local coffee shop with a bakery does. I'm like, how much do we love what we get out of McDonald's that we're willing to subsidize it to such an extent? And it's because we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity in our communities, and we've discounted all of the things that are necessary in order to build productive places. And so when it comes to budget day, and the city routinely has to say, we have to cut this library, we have to cut services at this space, we need to basically lean on or squeeze local developers in order to get a little bit more out of them to cover past expenses that we've been overlooking for quite a while. It's a consequence of a land use pattern and a lack of productivity that is sapping our capacity to provide for the things that we need. And out of this, it raises a question, what changes when we look at the patterns that make for a safe and productive street? Does a safe and productive street actually look more like what we see in most of our downtowns that were developed before the advent of the suburban experiment? Or does it look much like the next to the highway, expansive sort of suburban style development that we see over here? One oriented exclusively and entirely to the needs of people moving in automobiles, whereas the other allows for and accommodates and welcomes people in vehicles, but also is making room for so many more types of users and people to be participants in this space. Briefly, this is in Bothell, Washington, so just south of here, or south, 2.5 hours south of here. The property firm Urban 3 took a look at the relative economic performance of various parcels of land within the community on a taxable sales per acre basis. And you can see that the significant concentration of capacity within the community. And what's interesting is I went to Bothell, and these are not high towers. They're not 20 stories, 30 stories, 40 stories. These are just modest structures, some of them a couple of stories, but having the capacity to vastly financially outperform even the big box stores. And this is actually a big box store where they've actually done a fairly good job about using it in a much more space-constrained way. But the rest of the city struggles to provide any additional tax base to the city in comparison to the economic powerhouse in the community. Again, this is not the only part of the talk, but I was in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and gave a talk there and had shared with their city leaders that they had built out a brand new big box sort of power center on the outskirts of the city. Beautiful. Money came from Toronto and probably from other financial centers all around the world. It was done basically to the template and the style that all of the other power centers are built to. All of the usual suspects are present there. And I compared that site, it was an 11-acre site, and I compared it to their downtown Salvation Army that had not received any investment in decades. that was dilapidated, that was run down. And that dilapidated Salvation Army building, at its, in a sense, on its worst day in 2022, was as financially productive as the brand new big box store, which doesn't make sense. If you bought a brand new vehicle, you would expect it to have more performance, more capacity than the old clunker that's sitting in your garage. And yet the challenge is that we've lost sight of the fact that when we get the type of growth that even here in Langley we're seeing, oftentimes the quest or the desire is, well, we should just get more of the stuff that every other city has, rather than asking the question, what is it that every city has at its core that is so valuable? And then again, on the question of transportation, how do we create the conditions that allow these types of things to flourish and to prosper? And so the traditional development pattern, we always say we need to be careful and basically step back from our experiment to the suburban style of development, and we need to return to the traditional development pattern. It looks like a concentration of activity, not a dispersal of activity, and prosperity building opportunities for people in a community. It looks like ongoing adaptation to local pressure as the pressure emerges, rather than locking it in with zoning bylaws that restrict height, that restrict size, that restrict the capacity to invest in a place. We often talk about, especially inner core neighborhoods, people say, well, we need a good infill strategy. And I'm always like, infill sounds like something you get at the dentist. What we just need is more investment in these places, but people have been forbidden from actually investing in modest improvements in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in addressing the needs of a place to say, we could probably have a little mini coffee shop in my front yard, and I bet I could make this go. Or I bet I could run a sewing shop out of my backyard. I can do all of these things, and up until recently, even those things were not allowed. And in this context, what we see in the traditional development pattern, this is evident throughout the world, is the ability to accept incremental change and to ensure greater financial opportunity through proximity, through being near to each other. And so it's the traditional development pattern looks like assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods, and benefiting from that, benefiting from its vibrancy, benefiting from the fact that you can name it. And it's not because it came from a developer's playbook, but because it actually came from the place developing its own identity, developing its own capacity to understand its fabric, its shape, the fact that it was shaped by many hands in a place. And so this is the challenge that we see all across North America. 1936, this image is from Grand Rapids, but move forward to date, this is what they've done with it. And one person said, if any trend is visible, I'd say that it seems that things have become more boring looking. And they were picking up on sort of an aesthetic question. Which do you prefer? Do you like old-timey stuff, or do you prefer new-timey stuff? But the challenge is, if you were to do a financial performance of both of these, the one in the earlier years on a like-for-like basis would vastly outperform this. Notice how this has been simplified. Notice how this does not allow for additional incremental growth in the way that these older structures regularly were turning over. The one that was dilapidated would be torn down because there was sufficient value in the neighborhood to justify spending additional money in that space. You can see the liveliness of the street front. You can see the capacity that exists there for many hands and many owners and many participants to be part of it, to have the complexity that city planners and city engineers really struggle with, and yet is so critical and necessary to what we need. Even things like lot coverage, being able to make maximal use of scarce land rather than continuing to arbitrarily require significant setbacks, significant amount of land. I don't think this gets used very much, for example. Neither does this space. It's just there as window dressing for people that are passing through in their vehicles. And the consequence of this is that you lose that vitality, you lose that vibrancy, and critically, you also begin to lose your streetscape. You begin to lose the things that make this street far more productive because of the ability to unlock wealth on the private side, as well as the ability to modestly make best use of the amount of private investment or public investment that went into these places. Notice it makes sense for there to be transit in this area because it's serving a significant cluster of compatible uses that match what the needs of a transit user would be. Whereas in the lower portion today, you don't see this. And so we see the warning signs were already becoming present in the 1950s. The efforts to segregate uses through zoning bylaws, the efforts to begin to degrade the street by demanding more space for the vehicles, as well as the noise of the vehicles just continuing to course through these areas. being unrestricted in the capacity to go at speed rather than actually taking steps to narrow the lanes or make modifications of the streetscape in order to do this. The consequence of this is then you get this dispersal of resources rather than a concentration of resources and a limited opportunity to adapt. And so, like I said, a street is a terrible thing to waste. And what we see in these examples and so many others like it is that it is easy to begin to degrade a street. You can do this with a residential street. This was what my experience in Surrey was when we were saying, hey, you've just got to suck it up. We're sending cars down at speed down your lane. You want traffic calming? No way, because your street needs to be at a certain level of performance. Your street, which is your home, your base, your community, you're not going to be able to talk to your neighbors across the street because you won't be able to hear, you won't be able to, you'll struggle to be out in that lived environment. We do this all the time. And so the challenge is that, here we go. We come then to the question, well, if we build more intensively, doesn't that cause congestion? Doesn't that cause congestion? And isn't that the thing that Langley is gripped by? Certainly, if you read the coverage of the local election campaigns, if you read the coverage of local election campaigns in Delta or many other places, it's always, well, we need to resolve congestion. We need to get rid of congestion. But it asks the question, what causes congestion? Slowing and then stopping. Slowing vehicles or slowing people or slowing things is going to create some measure of bunching up, and with that, the act of stopping. But then they ask the question, what creates prosperous places? Well, slowing to notice and then stopping to engage. And this is so core to a rethink of what it means for us to understand the role of congestion in a place, to actually understand it as a value rather than something to dread. And this is necessary for markets, for restaurants, for a notary, for antique stores, for grocers, for churches, neighborhoods, little free libraries even, and lemonade stands that don't stand a chance on a stroad but survive and thrive on a street. Poor little Jimmy can't handle 6 lanes of cars, but does wonderfully in places that are actually designed for people to stop. And so I love this thing, and any place worth going to is going to have congestion. When you think back to the old days of, brothels and bars, the first time that you would set up your business in a place as the place was beginning to develop, your goal was to get people to stop, to linger, to dwell in a place. And so the consequence is that congestion is the price we pay for nice things. And this is where one of the key things that I would lay before you is always to ask the question, what is the type of congestion that is the most difficult to deal with? Well, it's airplane congestion. You can only send so many down the runway at once. Maybe ships. You can't have a ship take out a bridge in Baltimore. That creates a lot of problems. But automobile congestion ranks quite high in terms of the ones that is very difficult to deal with in comparison with people on foot or people on e-bikes or people on bicycles. There's so many more nimble ways for us to move through congested spaces where we see the dynamic capacity of a place to expand and actually bring in more participants, unless everyone is duty-bound or obliged or culturally assuming that they will be able to navigate that space in a vehicle. Geography, I always get this wrong. It's not geography that's the problem for cars, it's geometry. Just the sheer space required to move 1, 2, or 3 people is very significant in comparison with the alternatives that are available to us. And so one of the challenges that we have, and again, this is where it's not just we want a nice space or I want to be able to do yoga in my front yard and that's why I don't like cars. This is not anti-car. This is asking the question, what happens when we commit to a pattern of easing car congestion? This is something that the city or the township of Langley has committed to in so many of its planning decisions. The city of Delta, I'll tell you, our official community plan, the first 8 pages of it are the preamble, the vision statement, the conclusions of we met with the community and what they want is a safe, livable, inviting community. And we want to prioritize mode shift and encouraging people to use other forms of transportation. And then the rest of our bylaws take that opportunity all the way. The imposition of parking requirements removes that capacity of a place to allow a market determination of parking requirements and instead continues to impose top-down parking requirements that are arbitrary and do not actually meet the sufficient needs of a place. In my community in Delta, in Ladner, They lowered the parking requirements, and one of the market owners said, I think we still need 2 spaces per unit. So that's what they're building. They are meeting what they perceive to be the market requirement without being obliged to follow strict rules in terms of what the city requirement for parking is. But one of the challenges is let's start to add these things up. What does it mean for us to try to ease car congestion? Well, certainly it means infrastructure that we can't afford to either build or maintain. We see this all the time. Yes, there is money in the banana stand, but it often comes in the form of federal grants, TransLink grants, all of the different things that are being done, often with borrowed money. When I worked in Ottawa, I spent a 4-month internship working for the minister responsible for federal economic development in Northern Ontario region. And our project, or the thing that we were supposed to do, was identify all of the shovel-ready projects that could be funded, so that way they could go out the door and there could be a ribbon cutting quite quickly. They were roads and sewer plants that did not have a financial return on them, and so the consequence was the federal government couldn't be the sucker to pay for it. Chuck Green says a shovel-ready project is a project that people know doesn't pencil, and so they want someone else to pay for it. Roads, highways, major interchanges, all of these projects, there's a reason that these don't emerge at the city level. They emerge by provincial mandate, or they emerge out of the sense, we've got money, come get it. And the consequence of this is we begin to overbuild our car infrastructure, our resources that we make available for transportation, and we can't afford to build or maintain it. Think of the Kansas City example. How much more roadway that they added, not in Kansas City, in Peterborough, where they added all of this additional road capacity, and yet do not have the financial tax base to be able to cover the cost for it. Go to places where the winters rough up the roads just a little bit more, and you realize, these cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton and so many other places simply cannot keep up with the massive budget shortfall that they have, the identified needs that they have. Traveling in the States, I always wonder, is this going to be the last time I go over a bridge? As bridges look like they're about to collapse, and some of them are. Thankfully, I'm lucky so far, but one of the other challenges that we have is that the distances that we decide to routinely drive are amplified when we make a commitment to easing congestion. One of the ways that you ease congestion with vehicles is you space out stops. So that way people are less likely to stop, or stop less frequently, and they're less likely to slow down. You can get them to a destination that's just a little bit further away. You dissipate the traffic. The trouble with that is when you do that widespread, your entire system becomes predicated on the idea we will always be able to use distance to break up congestion, and the result of it is that everything becomes so widely spaced that you are obliged to use a vehicle to go significant distances, even for basic things. Even a simple thing. If you're a business owner and you say, I need to be able to attract attention. If you have people passing through in a congested area where things are slower, people are slowing, you actually have the ability to use a little sidewalk stand. You can have a person waving to somebody. You can do whatever you need to. But when it comes to these types of automobile inspired areas, look at the size of the signs back here. Look at the size of the infrastructure that is required. Look at the financial outlay required in order to, at minimum, just attract attention from a distracted meta. And so when we seek to ease car congestion, it increases costs. Another area, again, this is, I think this is important as we talk through these issues with a lot of people that may not immediately be on board with something like a walking track or a cycling lane or things like this. Easing congestion hurts entrepreneurs at the local level. To put it in this way, regional employment for regional people creates local scarcity for employees. You have the capacity to always get out to Campbell Heights, and as a result, you're going to be less likely to take the job that is local. You're less likely, if you're a student, if you can just drive from Mission into Delta, you're going to take that job. We bus people from Surrey out to Tsawwassen Mills because we have the capacity to simply get them on there on private coaches because of the ability that we have to attract all of these people. And on the one hand, we might say, I want to be able to live in one place of my choosing and work in another area. But people's actual lived experience shows that pretty quickly they realize this is not all it's cracked up to be. And so then the question is, do you either just ease the congestion to make their trip just a little shorter, or do you reorient your pattern of development so that way people begin to live nearer to their workplaces because there are workplaces that are near to where they live? It also results in the subsidized edge where land prices are less, where sometimes regulatory systems are a little bit more permissive, and you create the conditions for easy access to the North Shore, easy access to West Vancouver, easy access to Langley from Mission or Hope or even further. And the consequence of this is it actually sinks the local supplier. If I'm the local electrician, I pay for my commercial rate lease here in Langley, and I'm serving people in my community, but I'm constantly being undercut by the person that's always able to, at subsidized rates, move down the highway without any additional cost to them except for the fuel charge that they have, and be able to enter into my zone, enter into my market. I'm obliged then as a local entrepreneur to go into their areas, to spread out into their spaces, to go even further afield. And so it raises the question, what does it mean that back, I don't want to be nostalgic, but to say like previously, before the advent of widespread efforts to ease congestion, most towns had their own barber, most towns had their own mail spaces, most towns had all of the additional services, all of the additional capacities. And yet I grew up in the prairies, I grew up in southern Alberta, and there we began to see more and more of these places just close, the grocery store that could not stay open because because we had eased the congestion for them to go right into the heart of Lethbridge, we're going and getting their groceries there. We're impacting with their decision making the types of things that we were doing. Think even of the capacity of Amazon, as well as other distributors, to be able to bring in cheap goods, store them in localized warehouses, and then with ready access to our road networks, sink many local businesses, make it so difficult. And so we, at the same time, have not actually gathered what it takes to build lasting prosperity in our communities. It also worsens our transportation outcomes. Almost without a question, every effort that is made to block bus lane expansion, or block systems that allow buses priority access, or block systems that allow buses, for example, to have a clicker, kind of like an ambulance that allows them to advance the light so they can go through. Those things are blocked on the grounds that it's unfair to the people in the single occupant vehicle or the two occupant vehicle. And the consequence of this is that we actually sabotage many of the decisions that we could otherwise be making about where to put tracks in the roadway, for example, for a streetcar. Is blocked because it will add to congestion. But congestion is actually one of the things that will allow us to build a healthy place, and we can simultaneously move people by other means because we've concentrated them in ridership zones. We create the capacity for us to actually improve transportation outcomes, help people have more options to be able to live in a place and be able to endure much less sort of demand that they only use one method. It also sabotages natural mode shift. I'll be controversial. Adding the third lane to Highway 1 between here and Abbotsford directly contributes to the lack of appetite for investment in any other alternative like interurban rail to move people between these communities. The consequence of our widening of our interstate system and our highways has resulted in, across the United States, the decline of Amtrak as well as Via Rail here in Canada, as well as some government mismanagement, but we won't get into that. And so at Strong Towns, we talk about like no new roads. It's a radical idea. What if we committed to saying like, we will not build another road. We'll build many streets. We'll build the streets that are necessary in order to create a more fine-grained urban pattern. Or what if we said, we've already built enough roads. Let's just use what we've already invested in and use it better. And similarly, to end highway expansion, the highway transportation system across the United States and Canada is overbuilt and bloated. And the projects that are always underway, the next round of projects that are constantly coming, often have an invented metric of the amount of time that you can save if this project is completed. If we ease the congestion, then we can value each person's commute at half a minute, and their working wage is $33 an hour. I'm like, yes, please, I'll take that. But they say, no, that's how much you're worth. And then they come up with big numbers as the reason why they justify it. Or they say, it creates jobs. Neither of those are good ways for a healthy community to actually decide what it wants to spend it and what it wants to invest in. And so one of the challenges that we continue to point out is that we've gained insights in what it takes to build productive places, both from looking at our ancestors. What did they do with scarce resources to build healthy, vibrant communities that could withstand downturns and the times of boom and bust? And one of the observations is just very simple, like the curbside patios that Toronto allowed in 2020, 2021, into 2022, when they went and studied them. They said, look at how much more capacity it generated for our community in terms of taxes to the city, taxes to the province, income for local businesses, all of these types of things. And these types of details are widespread. Vancouver has shown this with bike lanes, with so many other investments into a place that you begin to see the impact radiate into the rest of the community. And yet, just yesterday or a couple of days ago, New York City is saying, hey, we need fewer sidewalk cafes. The worst thing that's happening on our streets is that people are putting up chairs and tables, lest they gather, lest they slow down, lest they get stop for a while, lest they congregate in a place and actually contribute to the well-being of the community, lest they be eyes on the street. And so we see this instinct to ease congestion, even the pedestrian congestion, when it actually comes at a significant cost to a place. Meanwhile, a really cool project they're doing is they're saying the streets that front our schools during school zone school times, we're turning them into play zones. Now, does that mean that vehicles have to navigate around it? Yes. Are they able to? Absolutely. They've got Hemis in there. Are they able to do so without significantly impacting the lives of the children that are now able to use these spaces? Absolutely. To awesome. They've done this down in Beach Grove as a pilot project where Beach Grove Elementary School has right in front of it a street that they've closed to vehicles. And they say, if you want to drop off your child, you drop them off on the perimeter. And you have a slight walk for your child, but they walk in a pedestrian zone, a pedestrianized area. And they've also taken one of the, if you can imagine this, the school is like this, and then there's a street that goes up into the neighborhood. And they've said that is also a walk and ride and play zone. That's something that we allow our children the freedom to access. And so they ask all the local drivers, don't use this street during the times when kids are coming to school and leaving school. And the consequence is incredible. Kids that previously were being driven are walking. They're participating in life. They're sharing time together. They're healthier. There's so many more benefits to doing this. And when it comes to housing, one of the challenges that we have is that we kind of look at something like this and we don't obsess about the fact that we've invested. So this is, I can't remember which city this was, but my colleague Everett did this where he took a look at overhead zoning overlays in terms of what the actual built form is. From a Strong Towns perspective, if you have made this investment in this street, you become obsessive about the financial performance of everything that fronts it. Because the thing that pays for this street to be here is all of the activity that's unlocked along its edges. And so the idea of simply allowing so many things to lay dormant and having high standards for when somebody is allowed to add to that street does not make sense. And we might think, oh, in the Lower Mainland, we don't have any streets like this. We really do. We still have a lot of spaces like this. And so what Edward did is he said, what if we, while improving the streetscape, improving the capacity of a place to actually be a great place for people to live, improving the safety performance, as well as adding additional parking that would be more protected than what was previously there. When we do that, we could also be permitting and encouraging the development of all of these additional properties. So you can see how much more of a tax base you would have, how much more significantly you would see the population density increase. And yet, who would show up at the public hearings to denounce this? The people that are so freaked out about congestion, while simultaneously ignoring the benefits that actually come from creating the places that are worth slowing down and worth stopping in, worth participating in, worth, as critically we see in these places, worth investing in. And this is another area where when we get this right, when we get the streetscape right and become obsessive about unlocking what can happen here, one of the great things that can happen is that rapidly you begin to see the deployment of additional homes. You begin to see the development of additional housing units. And one of the great needs that we have is actually to be careful about always defaulting to the multi-block developments. Hey, we're just going to knock this all down and then put in 48 units. Well, that puts everything under the control and the benefit of a single developer rather than allowing many hands to participate in this process and allowing housing come in at different times of age within the neighborhood, thereby unlocking additional capacity. If you're in the Strong Towns orbit, you'll be familiar with this image. This is in Actually, does anybody know what place is this in? This is a trivia moment. I'll give you a hint. It's in Michigan, and it's a beach town where there was parking lots and vacant businesses. And the city of Muskegon, Michigan said, hey, we heard that we have some local business people, entrepreneurs in our community, and they can't afford the downtown rents in the dilapidated sort of rundown buildings. They're still having to charge quite a bit because they're significant sizes. But we can't keep selling out of our garage. We want to be able to sell to people. And so what they said is, hey, this right behind here is a parking lot. And they said, why don't we invest $8,000 each for these little chalets? They're just sheds, but they call them chalets to make it sound nice. And they said to local business people, entrepreneurs, they said, you can rent this space for a really nominal rate. And they paired each one of them up with a small business advisor. And they basically allowed the bar of entry to be productive on a street that previously was just a sidewalk next to a gravel lot that people did not want to pass through. All of a sudden, these 8 units became 18. Most of the original occupants of these spaces ended up renting downtown spaces that were larger. They began to infuse so much more value into the community. And so we see this challenge that even in a place like Langley, you have vacant storefronts that have sat that way for a significant amount of time because no one could get the benefit of the doubt that their business idea, their prospect is actually going to pan out. Unless you get a chance to prove it. Unless you get a chance to demonstrate that you can develop a clientele here and ask them to meet you over here when you lease the larger space. That does not work if you say, oh, I did this in Port Moody and now I'm going to show up in Fort Langley. The bank says you don't have market studies, you don't know that that's going to work. And so one of the amazing things is not only can we lower the bar of entry when we get the streetscapes right and we begin to allow and encourage private investment, we can even do small things to encourage this type of thing. There are surface parking lots by the casino, for example, that this could just be along the street, creating additional opportunities for people. It puts eyes on the street. One of the things I love about it is if you're here and your child has an emergency, this person just says, hey, don't worry. I've got you. It's not that complicated to sell your trinkets. I've got you. You go take care of yourself. The community it creates, all of those things are so important. And all of this happens because it's on a street. This can be on the side of a 6-lane road. It has to be in a street environment. But when it is, it creates that great connection between a safe place and a productive place. And this is something that we're zealous about unlocking. And so we need to remove barriers. I'll run through these. These are standard, really critical along the way. Removing parking minimums, minimum lot sizes. These are all throwbacks to the suburban experiment. They are things that we need to get rid of. Building codes that forbid cheaper and better ways of designing buildings. For example, single stair or single point access buildings are a significant opportunity for us, and the province is taking steps to actually permit this now and allow it. And it will take some significant demonstration and proving that this is just as safe and provides far greater value to our communities. Design requirements that do the same. For example, getting rid of low floor area ratios and lot coverage ratios, and then seeking in every way possible to remove the uncertainty and the delay in the development approval process. But we've also got to stop doing things like this. I know I'm running a little long, but I want to touch on this because when we talk about safe streets, there's no reason that is there and not there. Except that this is considered the vehicular clear zone. The very place that we expect Granny and Sally and any number of other family members to navigate as they go through. And so I've said in our city, for example, BC Hydro puts hydro poles right in the middle of the sidewalk because the last thing they're allowed to do is actually just move it 1 foot over. It would be right at the curb line and they would actually be able to put it there. No, it's going to go right in the sidewalk. And so people are actively disabled by many of our design standards, by the fact that curb cuts are often not required when it makes obvious sense that should be there. And so people are actively disabled, that is in they are able to go about their day, but if they're not fully as able as sort of the person that's young and nimble and able to jump over a flying building in a leap, if you're not that person, you're going to suddenly come up and be like, oh man, this place is not designed for me. But I think that what this does is it also surreptitiously disables so many people. And I say it in this way. if you are at all concerned that you are a vulnerable road user, a vulnerable participant in the public square, if you're walking with a wheelchair and you realize, my loved one, if I can dodge the car that is careened off the road and is not stopped by the guardrail until after they've careened the person in the wheelchair, if I'm the one that can jump out of the way, I shouldn't be taking the person that can't. If I'm riding a bike with my child, I'm not going to ride this street, or I'm going to think twice about it, or I'm going to tell them, hey, go faster, and I'm not going to take the time to slow down, to notice, even to stop. This is inhospitable, and it's upon us. We've done this to ourselves. There's absolutely no reason why this could not actually just hem this in. This is not a highway where we expect people to be doing 120, but we've designed it with the very conditions that allow that to occur. My brother-in-law updated the advertising board in Winnipeg with this, where he said, if you knew what that was for, you would never sit here. Does anyone know what that is, what he's pointing to with the arrow? The shear pins for the breakaway posts. So that if you clamber into it with your vehicle as you leave the roadway, they do this on a highway, which makes a ton of sense. Most of these posts, if you plow into them, they will actually kick up so that way your vehicle is not slamming right through it and basically be able to go underneath it and carry on. Well, hopefully not carry on. You should probably stop at that point. But we've done the exact same thing on the side of our urban streets and our suburban streets, and we've created the conditions where people are either taking note of it and be like, yeah, I'm never sitting here, which means I'm never using that public space. I am exempting myself from that area, or I'm a sitting duck. This was the scene just around the corner from that space where a vehicle came off the roadway, plowed right into the parking space. I mean, not the parking space, the sitting area for the bus stop. Question is, the red is the clear zone, and then the yellow is the additional clear zone. And there's been no effort to say we could put bollards there. We could do simple measures that would highlight right here is the limit. Right here is where we actually repel cars back into the travel lane. Right here is where we protect the most vulnerable in our community. And the consequence of this is that this environment with this spacious clear zone is the reason why the development pattern also looks like this. It's the reason why no one says, I'm ready to open up a little jazz cafe and I think I'm going to stick it right here. Look at the carnage that has happened to some of our businesses that have the misfortune of being stuck on the middle of roads. This is the thing that actually made me a Strong Towns advocate. Is I was looking at my community asking, one, why don't my people know the church that I was pastoring? I was like, why don't the congregants know their neighbors very well? And secondly, we've got these old buildings, but they can never keep tenants. It's because they were bordered by two roads that just blasted right through them and degraded the space that was available. And who suffered? Well, I did, because I didn't have a place that I could go for a local coffee or go and meet somebody or go to the butcher or go to those types of things. But actually my community suffered because we didn't harvest additional capacity in terms of the financial performance of that space. A couple more slides here. I want to introduce the idea that whether people drive is a binary variable. It's a yes or a no. And I do want to insist that many more people don't drive than are often accounted for. But even when people drive, how much they drive is a sliding scale. And this is where all of the activity has to be. We run the risk, even at Strong Towns, we're very careful to never try to denigrate people that choose or need to use vehicles because they occupy a really important role in our communities. But the question of how much that vehicle must be driven in order to do basic things is definitely a question that we want to be asking all of the time. And so what land use or infrastructure decisions would allow you not to give up your car, but to drive, say, 20% fewer miles or kilometers each week? I'm borrowing this from my colleague, Daniel Harrigus. Allowing more retail in residential neighborhoods. Allowing that to emerge by right. Allowing it to merge without much complaint. Allowing it to happen without enlisting the neighborhood to reject it in opposition. Things like parking protected bike lanes. Actually using the big massing hulks of aluminum, rubber, and steel to serve as a massive bollard to protect the people that are more vulnerable, rather than always exposing people to harm where they are pinched between vehicles and parked vehicles. We continue to do that to ourselves. There are very simple modifications to our streetscape where we simply paint the Part 2 line so that people park on that line, and then just to the right of them, near the sidewalk, is where you can have, not only for cyclists, but actually that's where you're going to see joggers. Joggers don't normally use bike lanes when they're not protected, but they do all the time when they are. People that are pushing jogging strollers, people that are on e-bike or on e-scooters, all of those things, even people in e-wheelchairs are the ones that are making use of those types of spaces as an alternative to the sidewalk, which is so often contested. Priority signaling for transit systems, as well as for pedestrians. All of those things unlock the capacity to do this. Crosswalks, bump outs. You can see I was just starting to say we need all of this. Apportioning streets based on a new set of values to increase the development of new businesses because of new residents in a place. That will begin to change your own transportation patterns. As you see more people move in, the one response is to say, I need to stop it. I can't handle anymore. The change that it's introducing to my patterns of transportation are too much. I don't like sitting in traffic. The alternative is to say, within this lies the opportunity for new businesses to emerge, for new people to actually participate in making my place stronger, healthier, more vibrant. But our suburban style zoning bylaws, all of the restrictions and regulations that we have actually forbid the type of organic emergence of new opportunity that would come if we actually got out of the way significantly and made this available to people. Another core part of it is we need to stop allowing, like you see in Walnut Grove, many of the access restrictions so that you get a townhouse development, but there is no penetration through that townhouse development onto the next space so that you can totally skip the stroad and walk the neighborhood, walk the street, because the streets have been abolished in favor of single access or double access dumping out onto a stroad rather than allowing people to use adjoining neighborhood streets. This is critical. Cities can actually do so much with this. If they say you're doing land assembly, if you have the ability to buy 8 adjacent units, you should be able to buy the one just behind it as well and create the path through it. But people raise holy hell because they think that they have bought quiet and peace, even though you can create quiet and peace by actually restricting the amount of automobile traffic in those spaces. You can continue to allow it to be useful for pedestrians, for cyclists, and you reshape people's transportation decisions as a consequence of that. And so traffic will be bad where there are a lot of drivers. They have to travel long distances to meet their basic needs, and they're funneled at a small number of onto a small number of routes to do so. But the inverse is true as well. If you want to make traffic better, you can either get people out of their cars or get people who do drive to make shorter trips less often by bringing destinations closer to them. And in addition to that, or even if you did that all on its own, just creating more viable alternative routes for people who drive to avoid choke points. This runs counter to the transportation engineering sort of mantras across the United States and Canada, and yet it is something that we can see and see evidence of all across. All of our traditional neighborhoods have these features. We've done studies and shown the math on what this looks like, but it means that we have to say this is clearly a transportation decision and a financial decision that's being made. In this context, there's so much that we can begin doing to actually rehabilitate these areas, to improve these spaces, to bring businesses up to the street, to be able to close one of these lanes, at least one of them, to be able to make additional space available for the people that are choosing to go this way, or to take these spaces and turning them into transit systems that carry 30, 40, 50 people per vehicle, while simply saying for the remainder of these lanes, they'll be available for those that are in 1 or 2 person occupant vehicles. It looks like actually just being okay with a little bit of chaos, a little bit of madness, a little bit of people using the space and adapting it for their needs. We need to change the way that we approach what it is that we assume is the dominant form of development. This is legal to build almost everywhere. They come in a kit. The investment comes from afar. The consequence is persistent in our communities. Whereas we've made the things that we actually value, the things that people take pictures of in Fort Langley and in Langley City, not in Walnut Grove very much, but we've made those things difficult to build. And it's a consequence of us losing sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. Again, Times Square, before and after being pedestrianized, all of this, you see the way in which the reallocation of space created far greater opportunities. None of these businesses had to close because they suddenly couldn't have somebody park right in front of the business. Simultaneously, every one of those businesses began to flourish because of the additional attraction, the additional draw that it had. If you say, well, that's New York, you could even see it in very small communities where just by adding additional capacity into place, reallocating, repurposing the street, something that we care about deeply because it generates productivity for our places. That is what it takes to build more productive places. Again, a reminder in the challenge that parking is the lowest value of land. And the goal for any land should be to become so desirable that nobody wishes to use it for such a low value use. And this is something that requires a fundamental rethinking at our city levels. And again, I haven't once mentioned environmental issues. I haven't once mentioned health, which is significant in its own way. The things that we have done that have made people less healthy than they could otherwise be. I've not even mentioned independence of seniors, of those with disabilities, of children, of those that are immigrants and on limited means. There's so many other factors that are in play here, but even just financially, we have to understand these things as we go. That's what changes the type of orientation where we say, if this street, it has value, and if this street has value, then we're not going to degrade it by doing things like slip lanes that just create a car sewer and make it difficult for people to actually navigate these places in a safe and dignified and humane way. No one is so benefited by the ability to move so rapidly through that slip lane. They couldn't have waited, made the turn at the appropriate time. Slip lanes are one of the prime examples of what we've done with a suburban style mindset to move vehicles rapidly in order to combat congestion and simultaneously degraded the experience of actually being in a community. And so this was Tim. He was an old builder and contractor that reached out to me. This is a stock photo, but I imagine him. He told me he's in his 80s, and he was a builder for decades. And he was building projects in Wisconsin and for decades, as I said. And when he turned his project over, or his business over to his son, he said what changed really struck me. He said, in my day, I would build very modest structures. The town needed a new outbuilding for the sewage treatment plant. I would go and build a very modest, tiny little structure. And he said, what happened with my son is my son became way more successful than I ever dreamed I could be. But he was doing massive, huge projects, always with bonded money made available by outside forces, basically just overbuilding the supply in our community. And he said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting and enduring prosperity. And it got to the point where he had seen this building up over the years. And he said, I'm so troubled by what I'm seeing, but I can't quite put my finger on what's going on. And then he listened to the Strong Towns podcast and he heard Chuck talking about it. He said, whoa, this is spooky. And so he left a message for me being like, is Strong Towns a cult? Because he's like, I think either you guys are onto something or you've led me astray and all of a sudden I'm down the deep end. And so I said, no, we're not a cult. We don't ask for your wives or your money or anything like that. We're just committed to actually asking this question. What does it take to build lasting prosperity in a place? 4-step process, I'll skip that just to conclude with this. Great streets are safe. Great streets are for people, and great streets are possible. And so I'm so glad you've come out tonight. Thank you for taking this opportunity to learn a little bit. I hope we can also share a bit in the discussion that follows, and certainly enjoy a beer. And thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.